Hello everybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this sentence probably sounds familiar to you. Every movie these days is either a sequel, remake, or reboot. Chances are, if you've been anywhere on the internet in the past 5 years, you've probably heard that sentence, or something similar, at least once before. This likely prompts the question, is that really true? And the answer to that question is... yeah, pretty much. If you look around you, the vast majority of movies today fit into one of those three categories. Granted, 2023 has provided us with a few notable departures from that, but again, those are the exceptions, not the rule. Generally speaking, the majority of movies released today are, in fact, either a sequel, remake, or a reboot. And even if a newer film doesn't seem to fit this mold at first glance, chances are it was made with the intention of eventually spawning future projects. Take the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, for instance. While the presence of sequels, remakes, and reboots are undeniable in the modern world of cinema, today, I'd like to pose another question. Is that really a bad thing? Well, as it turns out, that's a complicated question, and before we get to answering it, I think we should break down each category, starting with sequels. Sequels are probably the easiest to defend of the three and are without question held in much higher regard than remakes and reboots, and it's very easy to understand why. Some of the greatest, most universally praised movies of all time just so happen to be sequels. The Godfather Part 2, The Empire Strikes Back, Blade Runner 2049, Aliens, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and the list only goes on from there. Does this justify every single sequel ever made? Of course not. I'll be the first to tell you that there have been plenty of downright awful sequels released over the course of history, but what it does do is prove that sequels, as a fundamental concept, are not innately flawed. Sometimes, you want to tell a grand, epic story, or a story that takes place over the course of several years that wouldn't be able to breathe in just one film. In these circumstances, sequels are warranted. In others, they're not. Now, let's look at the other two categories, remakes and reboots. I've seen a lot of people online use these words interchangeably, but regardless of what others might have you believe, they are not the same thing. A remake is a film that tells the exact same story in the exact same way a previous film did, usually with a fresh coat of paint and maybe a few minor alterations here and there. Alternatively, a reboot attempts to tell a story that's new and different, or reusing things like characters, settings, etc. from a previous film. If this is starting to confuse you, I'll put it like this. The recent Disney live-action movies, 2014's RoboCop, and the upcoming A Color Purple are remakes, whereas things like The Monsterverse, the Amazing Spider-Man series, and the new James Bond movies are reboots. Reboots, while not quite as looked down upon as remakes, tend to have negative connotations associated with them. In some cases, this is deserved. However, I feel as though as a whole, people treat them a bit too harshly. To explain why, let's look at one of my favorite film franchises of all time, the Batman series. If movie reboots never existed, then we wouldn't have the new Matt Reeves film. We wouldn't have the Dark Knight trilogy, we wouldn't have the animated series, we wouldn't have the Burtonverse. Even the Adam West movie and TV show would technically be cheating, because the first time Batman was ever put to film was in the form of 1943 serials. I don't know about everybody watching, but personally, I do not want to live in a world where this guy is the only Batman ever put to film. No offense, sir, I'm sure you did a great job for the time. Now, with all that being said, do I think there are circumstances where a series was rebooted when it didn't have to be? Absolutely. For instance, there is absolutely no reason on God's green earth why the Marvel Cinematic Universe needs to be rebooted. Endgame only came out a little over 4 years ago. The story for the first 3 phases was perfect. The cast was perfect. The effects still hold up remarkably well, even for the older films from Phase 1, and it's not even like they ran out of stories to tell in the current continuity, either. There's still a plethora of interesting characters from the original comics that they haven't even touched yet, and exciting stories from the mythos that haven't been told. I cannot stress it enough. From a creative perspective, there is not a single valid reason in existence why the MCU should be rebooted. Do I think that reboots are overdone in the world of film today? Definitely. But are they completely flawed on a fundamental level? Once again, no, and I think it's important that we know the difference. Personally, I think the reboots are justified in situations where either 1. The initial film or series had potential, but wasn't successful, like the Percy Jackson series, or 2. The people behind it have a plan to tell a unique story and not just a lazy retelling, like the Batman series. Lastly, let's talk about remakes. Out of the 3 categories we've been discussing in this video, remakes are by far the most hated, and it's pretty easy to see why. 9 times out of 10, they are a lazy retelling of the original film, with nothing but a fresh coat of paint thinly spread over it. Oftentimes, they completely strip away of the things that made the original so special, resulting in a cheap, bland, hollow, artificial impersonation of a film. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not someone who thinks that the films and stories of yesteryear should be forgotten. I often think about old world civilizations like ancient Greece and Rome, where their stories and legends were passed down from one generation to another over the course of countless years. I suppose some could argue that remakes are the modern equivalent of that. However, I think the key difference here is that ancient Greeks and Romans had very limited methods of preserving their legends and stories. We don't. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the classic films of days gone by have never been more accessible than they are today. The era where films could only be viewed in the movie theater and nowhere else is now long behind us. You no longer need to wait an unknown amount of time before a given film becomes available at your local video store, and you no longer need to scour the earth looking for one specific DVD. If you want to watch virtually any movie from any era of film history, it's as easy as the click of a button while laying comfortably in your own home. What baffles me is that despite being in an era of unprecedented availability, the presence of remakes has never been more significant than it is today. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why that could be, and even after really racking my brain, I genuinely don't have an explanation. If you want to preserve the legacy of classic films, then I agree with your sentiment. However, I think there are much more effective and efficient ways to do that in the year 2023. You can make a bigger spectacle of re-releases and anniversaries. As opposed to remaking the films in their entirety, you can just remaster them with updated visuals, effects, and music. You could tell different versions of the stories in question, the way Fanscription does in their videos. Even retelling the story from another character's perspective, the way Maleficent did a while back, is a much, much preferable alternative to just shamelessly and lazily retelling the exact same story in the exact same way a prior movie did. However, despite everything I've said just now, and regardless of all my harsh words, even remakes have a place in the world of film. To anyone who's watching this and thinking to themselves, are you clinically insane? How, after everything you said right now, can you possibly even attempt to argue that remakes aren't the worst thing to ever plague the art of cinema? To those people, I only have one thing to say. One piece of evidence to support my argument. The one and only example in the entire long history of film that I can think of that single-handedly proves that remakes are not innately flawed. Scarface. Personally speaking, Scarface is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I think it's pretty evident that I'm not the only person to feel this way. Many people would agree that there's a lot to love about the film, from its rags to riches story, to its iconic lines, to the stellar way it captures the atmosphere of 80s Miami, to the criminally underrated soundtrack. It is an absolute masterpiece of a film, but what many people don't know about it is that it's a remake. The original film came out in 1932 and starred Paul Mooney as Tony Camonte. Despite both films telling the same story, it's undeniable that each film offers a different experience. Additionally, the scenes in the remake that mirror the original don't feel like they were blatantly ripped off or used for a cheap pop. They feel like they come from a place of genuine reverence. The Scarface remake is not a perfect film by any means, and many of the criticisms against it are valid. You could argue that it's overly violent, and that Al Pacino's take on Tony Montana was a bit too loud, or that the story's final arc was a bit unneat. There's a lot you can say about this film. The one thing that you can't call it is bland or artificial. Because of that, the film feels like a genuine homage to the original, and not a lazy knockoff looking to profit off of name recognition. If every remake was like Scarface, I don't believe people would be complaining about them. But the problem is, they're not. Once again, the existence of Scarface does not cancel out every single bad remake ever made, and the fact still stands that they're ridiculously overdone in the modern age, but it once again proves that they're not fundamentally flawed as a concept. If remakes never existed, neither would Scarface. And personally, a world without Scarface is not a world I'd like to live in. Now, let's go back to our original question. Is the presence of sequels, remakes, and reboots in the modern world of film a bad thing? Well, in and of itself, no. But as the old saying goes, too much of anything, even a good thing, is a bad thing. And sequels, remakes, and reboots are no exception. While all three of these categories are definitely justified in existing in the filmic landscape, the reality is they're massively overdone, and a lot of times they're done wrong. A lot of people look at the current state of cinema and get very pessimistic. However, I don't think they should. I'm confident that the world of film will see a return of fresh, innovative ideas in the near future. While I don't want sequels, remakes, or reboots to disappear entirely, I think it's about time that all three categories take a small step back to let other types of movies flourish alongside them. Personally, I'd love to see more biopics about music artists and other entertainers. I'd also like to see more movies based on historical epics and old world mythology. And given the 80s dark fantasy trend on YouTube from a little while back, I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. How is it 2023 and we still haven't had a major motion picture about any of the founding fathers? Why are movies based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft basically non-existent? Speaking of non-existent, people have made whole videos about how we haven't had a lot of comedies in a while. I think it'd be very nice to see them make a comeback. While we're at it, I think it'd also be fun if mafia movies had another revival. In short, I'm of the belief that the best eras of cinematic history are the ones with the most variety. While some might call it naivety, I'm confident that we're approaching one of those eras very, very soon.